The Chinook descended through a sky the color of burned copper, kicking up a storm of Afghan dust that swallowed everything within 20 feet. The rotors screamed. The landing was rough, the kind that rattled teeth and reminded every soldier on board that they were no longer anywhere close to home. When the ramp dropped, the heat hit like a wall. Dry, suffocating, relentless. Kunar province didn't welcome anyone. It simply absorbed them, the way the desert absorbs everything, quietly, completely, without apology. Staff Sergeant Mara Calloway was the last one off the bird. She stepped onto the gravel of forward operating base Kestrel with her ruck squared tight against her back, her rifle slung clean across her chest, and her eyes already moving, scanning the layout of the base, clocking the guard positions, measuring distances between structures out of pure professional habit. She had done this in 3 other countries. She had done this in conditions far worse than this. Her boots hit Afghan soil, and her mind was already working, already building the map she would need, already cataloging every detail the base wanted to keep hidden from a newcomer. Nobody came to meet her. That told her everything. The men of 3rd Platoon Bravo Company were arranged in a loose, unhurried cluster near the motor pool, some leaning against sandbags, some squatting in the shade of a canvas overhang, all of them watching the new arrival with the particular kind of flat, assessing stare that men in combat units reserve for outsiders. Not hostile, exactly. Not welcoming either. Something colder than both. The kind of look that said, prove it or get out of the way. Mara had seen that look before. She kept walking. Lieutenant Derek Vasquez stood apart from the group, clipboard in hand, wraparound sunglasses hiding whatever his eyes might have given away. He was a solid-built man, late 30s, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete and never adjusted since. He had the posture of someone who had earned his authority the hard way and intended to keep it exactly that way. When Mara stopped in front of him and reported in, he looked up from his clipboard briefly, the kind of brief that was a statement in itself, and gave her a nod that was technically an acknowledgement and nothing more. "Calloway," he said, flipping a page, "you'll handle comms and mapping, perimeter checks Tuesday and Friday, report to Sergeant Reyes for your orientation." He looked back down at the clipboard. "Welcome to Kestrel." No handshake, no eye contact, done. Mara stood there for exactly 1 second longer than she needed to, not out of hesitation, but out of the quiet, deliberate habit of making sure a person knew she had heard them and had not been diminished by what they said. Then she picked up her bag and turned toward the barracks. Behind her she heard it. A low murmur, a short exhale of amusement, one voice cutting just above the rest, Private First Class Danny Ochoa, 22 years old and already an expert in the particular art of being underestimated by exactly nobody, leaning toward the man beside him and saying just loudly enough, "They sent us a clerk." Quiet laughter, brief, satisfied. Mara didn't break stride. She found her bunk at the far end of the barracks, the last one, nearest the generator, which meant she would sleep every night with the low mechanical groan of the base's power supply rattling the wall 6 inches from her head. She noted it, accepted it, and began unpacking with the efficient, methodical precision of someone who had long ago stopped expecting fairness and started expecting obstacles. Every item had a place. Every piece of kit was checked, positioned, and ready. Within 15 minutes, her space was squared away with a neatness that would have impressed a drill sergeant and baffled the men who had assumed she would struggle to find the latrine. Then she sat on the edge of the bunk and pulled out the first map. Kunar Province, Eastern Afghanistan, one of the most kinetic, complex, and unforgiving operating environments in the entire theater. She had read the briefings on the flight in. She had memorized the grid references, the known tribal boundaries, the reported Taliban movement corridors, the locations of previous IED strikes along the primary routes. But reading was one thing, understanding was another. Mara spread the map across her knees and began going over it inch by inch, her eyes moving slowly, her mind building the three-dimensional picture that paper alone could never fully capture. She did not know yet what was coming. She did not know about the Korangal sweep, or the misidentified riverbed, or the ambush that would nearly cost the platoon everything. She did not know that within days, every man on this base who had looked at her like she was a liability would find himself staring at her like she was the only thing standing between them and a body bag. She knew none of that yet. But on her forearm, half hidden beneath the rolled cuff of her uniform sleeve, a coiled desert serpent tattoo rested in patient silence, the same way she did, waiting for the moment when the desert would finally ask it to strike. Morning at Fob Kestrel arrived without ceremony. The sun didn't rise so much as it detonated, a sudden, aggressive explosion of orange light that flooded the Kunar Valley and turned every shadow into a sharp black blade across the gravel. The temperature climbed fast, the way it always did in eastern Afghanistan, without warning and without mercy. By 5:30, the air was already thick and dry enough to crack lips. By 600, when 3rd Platoon assembled on the packed dirt PT field behind the motor pool, the heat was already something you had to push against just to breathe. Sergeant First Class Nico Reyes was already there. He stood at the front of the formation with his arms crossed and his jaw set, a man carved from 18 years of hard service and harder opinions. Reyes was not a cruel man by nature. He was, in the way that many combat veterans become, a man shaped entirely by the belief that weakness got people killed, and that the fastest way to find weakness was to apply pressure until something gave. He had broken 3 men in this platoon before they ever saw a firefight. He considered that a service. He considered it mercy, even better to know now than to find out downrange when lives depended on it. He looked at Mara Calloway standing in formation and saw someone who hadn't been tested yet. He intended to fix that immediately. 2 miles, he announced to the platoon, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who had never once in his life needed to repeat himself. Push pace. Anyone falls behind, they run it again. He let his eyes land on Mara for exactly 1 second longer than anyone else. The message was clear, wordless, and received by every soldier in the formation without confusion. They moved out. Reyes set the pace deliberately, not the standard PT tempo but something sharper, something designed to separate the platoon within the first quarter mile and expose whoever was going to expose themselves. The gravel crunched hard underfoot. Dust rose in small dry clouds around their boots. The sun pressed down from above like a physical weight. Within the first half-mile, 2 of the younger soldiers began to labor, their breathing turning ragged, their strides shortening. Reyes pushed harder. Mara ran. She ran the way she did everything, quietly, efficiently, and without any visible sign of struggle. Her breathing was controlled and measured, her stride even, her eyes fixed forward. She did not look left or right. She did not look at Reyes. She did not perform effort or mask it. She simply ran, and the miles passed beneath her boots the way they always had, one after another, steady and relentless, like the turning of something that could not be stopped. When they crossed the finish point, Mara was at the front. Not just ahead of the other soldiers, ahead of Reyes. She stopped, turned, and stood with her hands loose at her sides, breathing steady, her expression carrying nothing, no triumph, no challenge, no invitation for reaction. She had not run fast to prove something. She had run at her pace, and her pace happened to be faster than everyone else on the field. That was all. That was enough. Reyes crossed the line 7 seconds behind her. He said nothing. His jaw worked once, the way a man's jaw works when he is recalculating something he thought he already understood. Around him, the platoon finished in scattered clusters, several of the men glancing between Reyes and Mara with the careful, sideways attention of soldiers who have learned to watch the room before they react to it. Ochoa said nothing this time. Nobody laughed. But if Mara expected that moment to change anything, the mission briefing 2 hours later reminded her precisely how little one morning run counted for in a place like this. The briefing room at Fob Kestrel was a plywood-walled structure with a single overhead light, a large topographical map pinned to the far wall, and enough folding chairs to seat the platoon in 2 cramped rows. Vasquez stood at the front, pointer in hand, walking through the details of a reconnaissance sweep through the Korangal Valley, a stretch of terrain so historically violent that soldiers who had served there spoke about it the way people speak about places they are not sure they survived. Mara sat in the second row and listened. She always listened first. But her eyes kept returning to the map, specifically to one section, a dry riverbed cutting across the primary route, flagged in the satellite imagery as a stable crossing point. Something about it pulled at her. She had studied enough terrain in enough combat zones to know that satellite imagery, for all its precision, had one consistent and dangerous flaw. It captured what a place looked like, not what a place was. She leaned forward slightly, studying the contour lines around the riverbed. The elevation drop on the eastern bank was steeper than the imagery suggested. The approach angles on both sides were narrow, natural choke points. If anyone wanted to set a trap along this route, this was exactly where they would set it. She raised her hand. Vasquez glanced at her with the expression of a man who had already decided the meeting was essentially over. Calloway. Sir, the riverbed crossing at grid reference November Tango 44, the satellite imagery marks it stable, but the contour data suggests a significant elevation differential on the eastern approach. The entry and exit angles create a natural choke point. If the Taliban has any surveillance on this route, that crossing is exactly where they'd position for an ambush. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Vasquez clicked his pointer against the map once, the way a teacher dismisses an answer that technically belongs in a different class. Imagery's been verified by battalion, he said flatly. We move at 1800. He looked back at the rest of the platoon. Any other questions? Nobody spoke. Mara sat back. She did not argue. She did not repeat herself. She did not allow frustration to reach her face, because she understood something that Vasquez did not yet, that arguing without authority only closed doors, and she needed every door in this room to stay open. But the moment the briefing ended and the platoon filed out into the blinding afternoon sun, Mara returned to the map table alone. She pulled out her notebook. She spread her personal terrain analysis beside the satellite imagery and began working quietly, methodically, building an alternate route, a safer crossing 2 kilometers north, better approach angles, fewer choke points, harder to surveil. Nobody asked her to do it. Nobody knew she was doing it. She finished it in 40 minutes, folded it carefully, and placed it in the left breast pocket of her uniform, close to her chest, ready, the way she kept everything that mattered. Outside, the platoon was gearing up to move out without her. She could hear the organized noise of men preparing for a mission, the clatter of kit, the low exchange of final checks, the diesel rumble of vehicles. She stood at the map table and listened to the sound of them leaving. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were calm. And somewhere in the Korangal Valley, the riverbed waited, patient and dangerous, and exactly as wrong as she said it was. The Korangal Valley swallowed sound the way it swallowed light, completely, without echo, as if the mountains themselves had learned to hold their breath. Third platoon moved in a staggered column formation, 3 vehicles deep, with Vasquez in the lead MRAP and Reyes bringing up the rear. The route was exactly as planned. The pace was controlled. The radio chatter was minimal and professional. Everything, by every measurable standard, was going according to the brief. But there is a particular kind of quiet that soldiers learn to recognize in places like Afghanistan, not the absence of noise, but the presence of something waiting just beyond the edge of perception. The valley had that quiet now. Specialist Marcus Tully, manning the turret on the second vehicle, felt it first, a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his gear. He scanned the ridgelines through his optic, sweeping left to right, searching for movement that wasn't there, for shapes that didn't belong. Everything looked wrong in a way he couldn't name. The rocks, the shadows, the empty terraces where villages used to be. He keyed his radio twice, the platoon signal for heightened alert, but said nothing aloud because what was there to say? "It feels wrong" wasn't a report. It was just fear, and fear didn't change the route. The lead vehicle reached the dry riverbed at 1847 hours. Vasquez slowed as they approached the crossing. The satellite imagery had marked it stable, a wide, flat stretch of compacted sand and stone that should have supported the weight of an MRAP without issue. But the moment the lead vehicle's front tires touched the riverbed, Vasquez felt it. A subtle give in the ground. Not collapse, but something softer than expected, something that shifted under pressure in a way that hardened dirt should never shift. He was still processing that feeling when the world exploded. The first RPG struck the lead vehicle's rear quarter panel with a sound like the sky tearing open. The explosion lifted the back end of the MRAP 6 inches off the ground and slammed it back down in a shower of sparks and shrapnel. The second and third rounds came simultaneously, one from the western ridgeline, one from the north, both missing by meters but close enough that the concussive waves rattled teeth and turned the inside of the vehicles into chaos. Then the small arms fire opened up. AK-47 rounds hammering against armored plating in a sustained, disciplined volley that told every soldier in the platoon exactly what they were facing. This wasn't opportunistic, this was planned. They had driven directly into a kill zone. "Contact left, contact left," Tully's voice cracked over the radio, high and tight with adrenaline. He returned fire from the turret, his M240 chopping into the ridgeline in controlled bursts, suppressing positions he could barely see through the dust and smoke that was already filling the riverbed like fog. Vasquez keyed his radio. "All units reverse, get off the X, move, move, move." But the riverbed was narrow. The eastern bank was steep. And the Taliban fighters, whoever they were, however many there were, had chosen this position because there was no easy way out. The second vehicle tried to reverse and immediately bogged down in the soft sand Mara had warned about. The driver, Corporal Jamal Hayes, gunned the engine. The tire spun uselessly, digging deeper, kicking up plumes of dust that turned them into a stationary target. Reyes, in the rear vehicle, saw it happening and made the call instantly. "Dismount, dismount and get to cover." Two soldiers bilayed out of the second vehicle, Private Ochoa and Specialist Liam Cross, and sprinted for a cluster of boulders 20 meters to the east. They made it halfway before the machine gun fire from the northern ridge intensified. Both men went down behind a low stone outcropping, pinned, unable to move forward or back without exposing themselves to direct fire. Ochoa's voice came over the radio, breathless and shaking. "We're pinned. We can't move. We need suppression on the northern ridge now." Vasquez tried, Tully tried, but the enemy positions were dug in, elevated, and protected by terrain that made direct fire nearly impossible. The Taliban weren't amateurs. They had surveilled this route. They had waited, and now they were executing exactly the ambush Mara had predicted. Back at Fob Kestrel, Mara sat in the communications tent. She wasn't supposed to be there. Her assignment for the evening had been perimeter inspection, a task designed to keep her occupied and irrelevant while the real mission unfolded. But Mara had finished the inspection in half the expected time and returned to the tent, not because she had been ordered to, but because instinct and experience had taught her one unshakable truth. When a mission goes into a valley like the Korangal, you stay close to the radio. She was monitoring the backup frequency, the secondary channel that most units kept open but rarely used, when she heard it. Not the platoon's radio traffic. That was on the primary freak, loud and frantic and increasingly desperate. What Mara heard was something else, a fragmented, crackling series of transmissions in Pashto, coming from a frequency just outside the standard enemy communication range. She leaned forward, adjusted the dial with the kind of precision that comes from years of intercept work, and listened. The voice was calm, methodical, giving orders. She pulled out her notebook and began transcribing, her pen moving fast across the page, translating in real time. The words came together quickly. Secondary unit, northern approach, flanking position, wait for the signal. Her blood went cold. There was a second Taliban element, not on the ridgeline, moving in from the north. And if they completed their flanking maneuver, Ochoa and Cross, already pinned and exposed, would be caught in a crossfire with no cover and no way out. Mara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the handset, switched to the platoon's primary frequency, and keyed the mic. Her voice, when it came through every radio in the Korangal Valley, was calm, clear, and carried the kind of authority that does not ask for permission because there is no time left to ask. Bravo 3 Actual, this is Kestrel 6. Enemy flanking element inbound from your northern corridor, grid November, Tango 4629. Approximately 8 combatants moving fast, ETA 2 minutes. Advise immediate repositioning of PIN personnel to covered corridor bearing 0905 degrees, 20 meters east of current position. Covered route is clear. I repeat, route is clear. Move now. There was a half-second of silence on the other end. Then Vasquez's voice, sharp and strained. Kestrel 6, confirmed source of intel. Mara didn't waste time explaining. Intercepted enemy comms. Confirmed hostile movement. Sir, they don't have 2 minutes. Move them now. Another beat, then copy, moving. In the riverbed, Reyes heard the transmission and acted immediately. He keyed his mic to Ochoa and Cross. Listen up. Covered corridor, 0905 degrees, 20 meters east. On my mark, you break and run low. I'll suppress the ridge. Ochoa's voice came back tight with fear. Sarge, we can't see the corridor. You don't need to see it. Trust the call and move. 3, 2, 1, mark. Reyes opened up with everything he had, hammering the northern ridgeline with suppressive fire. Ochoa and Cross broke from cover and ran, sprinting low and fast toward the bearing Mara had given them. For 3 terrifying seconds they were completely exposed. Rounds snapped past them, kicking up dust at their heels. Then they hit the corridor, a natural depression in the terrain, hidden from the ridgeline by an outcropping of rock, and dropped into cover just as the Taliban flanking unit crested the northern rise. But they were too late. The Americans were already gone. Vasquez, seeing the flanking unit exposed on the high ground, called in the coordinates. 30 seconds later, mortars from FOB Kestrel screamed overhead and impacted directly on the Taliban position. The ambush collapsed. The enemy fighters scattered, and 3rd Platoon, battered and shaken but intact, extracted from the riverbed under cover of smoke and suppressive fire. Every single soldier made it out. When they rolled back through the gates of FOB Kestrel 2 hours later, covered in dust and streaked with sweat, Vasquez climbed out of the lead vehicle and stood in the fading light of the Afghan dusk. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked across the compound toward the communications tent, where a single figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, arms crossed, waiting. Mara met his gaze. She didn't move, she didn't speak. Vasquez stared at her for a long, quiet moment. Then he nodded once, slow, deliberate, and loaded with everything he couldn't yet say aloud. She nodded back. And somewhere in the Korangal Valley, the riverbed sat quiet and empty, exactly as dangerous as she had always known it was. 3 days after the Korangal ambush, a Black Hawk landed at FOB Kestrel unannounced. It came in fast and low, the kind of arrival that suggested either urgency or rank, or both. The rotors hadn't even stopped turning before a figure stepped off the bird, boots hitting gravel with the kind of precision that spoke to decades of doing exactly this in exactly these kinds of places. Chief Warrant Officer Alina Sphinx, Akafar, Defense Intelligence Agency, moved across the landing zone like she owned every inch of ground between the helicopter and the operations center. She was a tall woman, lean and sharp-featured, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She wore no body armor, carried no rifle, just a sidearm, a tablet, and the unmistakable aura of someone who had forgotten more about asymmetric warfare than most officers would ever learn. Vasquez met her at the entrance to the TOC, Tactical Operations Center, and offered a handshake that Okafor accepted briefly before moving directly to business. "Lieutenant, I'm here for the post-action debrief on the Korangal engagement. Battalion wants a full workup on how your intercept analyst pulled enemy comms out of thin air and called a flanking maneuver nobody else saw coming." She glanced at her tablet. "Staff Sergeant Mara Calloway, where is she?" Vasquez hesitated for just a fraction of a second, the kind of hesitation that comes when a man realizes he has been operating with incomplete information and is about to have that gap exposed in front of someone who outranks him in every way that matters. "She's likely at the comms tent, ma'am. I can have her called in." Okafor's eyes flicked up from the tablet. "No need, I'll find her myself." She turned and walked toward the far side of the base without waiting for directions, as if she had memorized the layout from satellite imagery before she ever stepped off the bird. Vasquez watched her go, something cold and uneasy settling into his chest, and then followed at a careful distance. Reyes, standing near the motor pool, caught the movement and fell into step behind Vasquez without a word. Within 30 seconds, half the platoon had noticed the unusual activity and begun drifting toward the comms tent, with the casual, aimless curiosity of soldiers who have learned to recognize when something important is about to happen. Mara was inside the tent, headset on, running through archived intercept logs from the previous week's patrol activity. She didn't hear Okafor approach. She didn't hear the door open. What she heard was a voice she hadn't heard in 3 years, low, steady, and carrying the particular tone of someone who has worked alongside you in places where mistakes got people killed. "Desert Serpent." Mara's hand froze on the dial. For one long, suspended moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, she pulled the headset off, set it down on the table, and turned around. Okafor stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh Afghan sunlight, arms crossed, a faint smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "Didn't think I'd find you in a place like this," she said quietly. "Thought you'd retired the call sign." Mara stood. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes, recognition, maybe respect, maybe something closer to relief. "Chief Okafor." "Sphinx," Okafor corrected. "We're past formalities, Serpent." She stepped into the tent, and behind her, Vasquez and Reyes appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unmistakable sense that they were about to witness something they hadn't been briefed on. Okafor glanced back at them, then at Mara, and raised an eyebrow. "They don't know, do they?" Mara said nothing. Okafor turned to face Vasquez fully. "Lieutenant, how much did Battalion tell you about Staff Sergeant Calloway's background?" Vasquez shifted his weight. "Standard personnel jacket, ma'am, signals intelligence specialist, assigned from INSCOM, clean record, that's what we were briefed." Okafor nodded slowly, the way a teacher nods when a student has given a technically correct answer that completely misses the point. She looked back at Mara, who stood silent and still, and then back at Vasquez. "Let me fill in some gaps." She pulled up her tablet, swiped twice, and began reading aloud in a tone that was clinical, factual, and utterly devoid of exaggeration. "Staff Sergeant Mara Calloway, 3 years embedded with Special Operations Task Force West in Iraq, 2006 to 2009. Primary assignment, deep penetration human and SIGINT operations in Mosul, Ramadi, and Fallujah. She ran 2 solo infiltration ops into contested urban zones to establish intercept positions that provided real-time intelligence on high-value targets. In November 2006, her signal intercept work identified a vehicle-borne IED convoy targeting a marine logistics unit outside Fallujah. Her warning gave them 11 minutes. 11 minutes, Lieutenant. That's the difference between 38 Marines going home and 38 families getting folded flags. The tent was dead silent. Akafar kept going. She also provided the intelligence that led to the capture of an al-Qaeda cell leader responsible for coordinating attacks across Anbar province. The operation required her to spend 4 days in a concealed observation post inside hostile territory with zero support and limited resupply. When extraction became compromised, she walked out on foot, 17 kilometers, at night, through enemy-controlled terrain. Akafar paused and looked directly at Vasquez. Her call sign isn't something battalion assigned, Lieutenant. It's something the operators gave her. They called her Desert Serpent because she moved through hostile ground without being seen, struck without warning, and by the time the enemy realized she'd been there, it was already too late. Reyes, standing just outside the tent, felt something shift in his chest. Not quite shame, not quite awe, but something uncomfortably close to both. Vasquez stared at Mara, his jaw working silently, as if trying to process a fundamental recalibration of every assumption he had made since the moment she stepped off that Chinook. Why? He stopped, started again. Why didn't you say anything? Mara met his gaze with the same calm, unflinching expression she had worn since the day she arrived. You didn't ask, sir. The simplicity of it hit harder than any accusation could have. Akafar closed her tablet. She requested a transfer out of SOF operations after her 3rd tour. Burnout, PTSD, take your pick. 3 years in that environment will do it to anyone. She wanted something quieter. Apparently, battalion interpreted quieter as irrelevant. She looked at Mara with something that might have been sympathy or respect or both. But you can't bury instinct, Serpent. The core angle proved that. Mara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Outside the tent, more soldiers had gathered. Ochoa stood near the back, his face pale. Cross stood beside him, staring at the ground. Tully, the turret gunner who had been on the ridgeline when Mara's voice came through the radio and saved their lives, stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, visibly trying to process what he was hearing. Akafar turned back to Vasquez. I'm here to conduct the debrief, Lieutenant, but off the record. You've had one of the best intelligence operators in the United States Army sitting in your comms tent filing paperwork for 3 weeks. I don't know what you plan to do with that information, but I'd suggest you think carefully about it. She nodded once to Mara, a gesture of equals, of shared history, of wars fought in shadows that most soldiers would never see, and walked out of the tent. Vasquez stood there for a long moment, staring at Mara, who had not moved, had not changed her expression, had not offered a single word of defense or explanation. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than it had been in weeks. Why didn't you tell me? Mara looked at him, and for the first time since arriving at Fob Kestrel, something almost like exhaustion crossed her face. Because respect isn't something you tell people to give you, Lieutenant. It's something you earn, or it isn't real. She picked up her headset and put it back on. Vasquez left the tent without another word. And across Fob Kestrel, the men of 3rd Platoon stood in the fatting afternoon light and realized, slowly and uncomfortably, that they had spent 3 weeks underestimating a soldier who had been 10 steps ahead of them from the very beginning. End of Part 4. The intelligence hit Fob Kestrel at 3:47 hours, delivered via encrypted SATCOM directly from Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force headquarters in Bagram. Lieutenant Vasquez was pulled out of a restless sleep by the duty officer and walked into the TOC, still pulling his uniform blouse over his shoulders. What he found waiting for him on the screen made him forget he was tired. High-value target, confirmed visual identification, time-sensitive. Hamid al-Rashwari. The name alone carried weight. Al-Rashwari was a mid-level Taliban commander responsible for coordinating IED networks across 3 provinces, a man who had been on coalition target lists for 18 months and had evaded capture by moving constantly, staying off phones, and operating through a network of couriers that made tracking him nearly impossible. Intelligence assets had been hunting him like smoke. And now, through a combination of drone surveillance, Informant reporting and sheer luck, they had him. A compound in the Petch River Valley. 36 hours, maybe less, before he moved again. Vasquez stared at the imagery, his mind already running through the logistical nightmare of mounting an operation on this kind of timeline. Limited intelligence, narrow window, high-risk target in deeply contested terrain. The kind of mission that could go wrong in 1,000 different ways, and most of those ways ended with body bags. He stood there for 5 minutes, turning it over in his mind, and then he did something that, 3 weeks earlier, would have been unthinkable. He walked to the comms tent and woke up Mara Calloway. She was awake before he knocked. Mara had trained herself years ago to sleep lightly in places like this, and the sound of boots on gravel at 400 was enough to pull her out of the shallow rest that passed for sleep in a combat zone. She was dressed and laced within 90 seconds. When she stepped outside, Vasquez was standing in the pre-dawn darkness, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "We have a target," he said quietly. "High value, tight window, thin intel. I need someone who can build a mission package from scratch in less than 12 hours. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that hadn't been there before, not quite an apology, but something close to acknowledgement. "I need you to lead the intelligence brief." Mara studied him for a moment, her eyes calm and measuring. Then she nodded once. "Show me what we have." By 600, Mara had taken over the corner of the TOC that served as the intelligence workstation. The space was barely larger than a closet, a folding table, 2 chairs, a laptop connected to SIPRNET, and a corkboard covered in maps and imagery that hadn't been updated in weeks. She cleared it all, pinned up fresh satellite photos of the Petch River Valley, and began building the operation from the ground up. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, relentlessly, and with the kind of focus that made the rest of the world disappear. She pulled every piece of available intelligence, drone footage, informant reports, previous patrol logs, terrain analysis, weather forecasts, local tribal dynamics. She cross-referenced everything, looked for patterns, discrepancies, gaps. She built routes and contingencies. She anticipated failures. She mapped not just what would happen if everything went right, but what would happen when something inevitably went wrong. 11 hours later, she had a mission package that would have taken most analysts 3 days to produce. At 1800 hours, Vasquez assembled the platoon in the briefing room. Every man from 3rd Platoon was there, Rays in the front row, arms crossed, jaw set. Ochoa and Cross near the back, still visibly processing what they had learned 3 days earlier. Tully by the door, chewing gum slowly, his eyes already locked on the maps Mara was pinning to the board. The room smelled like stale coffee, gun oil, and the particular tension that comes before a mission everyone knows is going to be difficult. Mara stood at the front of the room and waited for the noise to settle. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room went quiet on its own. "Target is Hamid al-Rashwari," she began, her voice calm and precise. "Taliban commander, IED network coordinator. Confirmed visual ID at a compound in the Petch River Valley as of 14:30 today. Window is 36 hours before he moves again. This is not a capture or kill authorization. This is capture preferred, lethal force authorized only if compromise is imminent." She pointed to the satellite image pinned to the board. "The compound is here. 3 structures. Main residence, secondary outbuilding, storage shed. Estimated 6 to 8 combatants on site, possibly more. Terrain is mountainous, forested approach from the north, open valley to the south. Local population is neutral to hostile depending on which family you ask, so we operate under the assumption that our movement will be observed and reported." She traced the infiltration route with her finger. "We insert here, 2 kilometers north of the compound at 200. We move on foot. No vehicles. Noise and light discipline absolute. The approach is through a forested ridgeline that provides concealment but limits maneuverability, so we move single file, 30-meter intervals, comms on whisper protocol only." Rays leaned forward slightly. his eyes following her finger across the map. Mara continued. Primary breach point is the northwest corner of the main structure. It's the farthest from the sleeping quarters and closest to our covered approach. Demolition entry is not an option. Too much noise, too much risk of collateral. We go manual breach, fast and quiet. Assault team clears the main structure while Overwatch secures the perimeter and monitors the secondary building. If Al-Rashwari attempts to flee, he has two options: the south entrance, which puts him directly into our Overwatch field of fire, or a tunnel exit I've identified here, on the eastern side of the property. She tapped the image. This is the contingency position. If he runs, this is where we intercept. Ochoa raised his hand tentatively. Mara nodded at him. Sergeant, how do we know there's a tunnel? Because there's always a tunnel, Mara said flatly. Men like Al-Rashwari don't survive 18 months by trusting walls. Satellite imagery shows disturbed earth on the eastern property line inconsistent with agricultural use. Informant reporting mentions hidden paths used by commanders in this area. And the compound layout mirrors 3 other Taliban safe houses we've hit in Kunar and Nangarhar, all of which had escape routes. So we assume it exists, and we position accordingly. The room was silent. Not the silence of doubt, the silence of soldiers realizing they were hearing someone who had done this before, many times, in places just as dangerous as this one. Mara moved to the next map. Extraction plan. We have 2 options. Primary extraction is back along the infiltration route to the northern LZ, where Rotary Wing will be on standby. Secondary extraction, if compromise occurs or we take contact, is a vehicle pickup at this grid reference, 4 clicks west. Depending on how the op unfolds, we may need to move fast and light, so everyone packs for speed, not comfort. She turned back to face the platoon. Questions. Tully spoke up from the back. What's the enemy response time if we get compromised? Approximately 12 to 15 minutes from the nearest Taliban checkpoint. Longer if they're moving on foot, faster if they have vehicles pre-positioned. That's why the breach has to be fast. We're inside, secured, and moving to extract within 10 minutes of entry. Anything longer and we're fighting our way out. Reyes uncrossed his arms and leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. What if he's not there? Mara met his eyes without hesitation. Then we confirm negative, sanitize the site and extract clean. No target, no engagement, but the intelligence confidence level is high. He's there. Vasquez, standing off to the side, watched her work the room with the kind of quiet authority that couldn't be taught. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply briefing a mission the way she had briefed dozens of missions before, clearly, thoroughly, and with the kind of competence that made every man in the room feel safer just knowing she had planned it. When the brief concluded, Mara rolled up the maps and looked across the platoon. We go at 200. Get your gear squared, get your rest. Stay tight, stay quiet, and trust the route. Nobody argued. Nobody questioned. For the first time since Mara Calloway had arrived at Fob Kestrel, the men of 3rd Platoon looked at her not as an outsider, not as a liability, not as someone to be tested, but as exactly what she had always been. A soldier who knew how to bring people home. The Pech River Valley at 200 hours was a study in absolute darkness. No moon, no ambient light, just the kind of black that swallows depth perception and turns every step into an act of faith. 3rd Platoon moved through it like ghosts, 12 soldiers in single file, 30 meters between each man, night vision painting the world in shades of green and gray. The forested ridgeline provided cover but demanded silence. Every boot placement mattered. Every breath was controlled. The only sound was the whisper of wind through pine branches, and the occasional scrape of gear against stone that every soldier mentally cursed themselves for. Mara moved near the front of the column, just behind Vasquez and the point man. She had memorized every meter of this route during her planning, every elevation change, every natural choke point, every place where the terrain could betray them. Her eyes swept constantly, reading the landscape through her NVGs with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this in worse places under worse conditions. She carried her rifle low and ready, her movements economical, her mind 3 steps ahead of her body. They reached the final covered position at 2:47 hours, a rocky outcropping overlooking the compound, approximately 150 meters from the northwest breach point. Vasquez signaled a halt. The platoon collapsed into a defensive perimeter, every soldier finding cover, every weapon oriented outward. Mara moved to the edge of the outcropping and glassed the compound through her rifle optic. 3 structures exactly as the satellite imagery had shown. The main residence was dark except for a single kerosene lamp burning in what appeared to be a common room. 2 armed guards visible, one near the southern entrance, one patrolling lazily between the main building and the outbuilding. No dogs, no vehicle movement, everything quiet. Too quiet, some part of Mara's brain whispered, but operational environments were never perfect. You worked with what you had. Vasquez moved beside her. Thoughts? Matches the brief, Mara said quietly. 2 visible sentries. Assume at least 4 more inside. The eastern side is blind from this angle, but the tunnel exit should be approximately here. She pointed to a section of disturbed ground barely visible in the thermal overlay. I'll position there. If he runs, I'll be waiting. Vasquez looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Do it. Mara moved. She broke from the main element and circled wide to the east, moving alone through terrain she had only seen on a map, trusting her memory and her instincts in equal measure. It took her 8 minutes to reach the position, a shallow depression behind a cluster of stones that gave her a clear line of sight to the suspected tunnel exit. She settled into the dirt, controlled her breathing, and became part of the landscape. Waiting. Watching. The way the desert serpent on her forearm had taught her years ago, patient, invisible, and ready to strike the moment opportunity presented itself. At 3:10 hours, the assault began. The breach team hit the northwest entrance with practiced precision manual entry, no explosives, fast and fluid. The door came open with a muffled crack. Flashbangs detonated inside with sharp, disorienting bursts of light and sound. Then the room was flooded with soldiers, voices shouting commands in Pashto and English, ordering occupants to the ground, weapons up, every Chinese letter of the structure being cleared in overlapping sectors of fire. It went flawlessly for exactly 45 seconds. Then someone inside shouted a warning, and the entire compound erupted. Gunfire ripped through the night, AK-47 rounds punching through walls, ricocheting off stone, the sharp crack of M4s returning fire in controlled bursts. One of the sentries outside went down immediately, dropped by Tully's precision shot from Overwatch. The second sentry tried to run and was tackled by rays before he could reach the alarm bell mounted on the outbuilding. Inside the main structure, the assault team encountered heavier resistance than expected. 6 combatants, not 4. 2 barricaded in a back room, firing through a doorway that created a fatal funnel. Ochoa took a round to his plate carrier that knocked him flat but didn't penetrate. Cross dragged him back while the team repositioned, stacking grenades and preparing for a final push. And in the chaos, exactly as Mara had predicted, Hamid al-Rashwari made his move. The tunnel exit opened. Mara saw it in her peripheral, a section of ground lifting, a concealed wooden hatch camouflaged with dirt and stones. A figure emerged, moving fast and low, dressed in dark clothing, no weapon visible but moving with the urgent, practiced efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this escape 100 times. Mara rose from her position, rifle up, her voice cutting through the darkness in flawless Pashto. Baz Wadirga, stop, don't move. Al-Rashwari froze. His head turned toward her, eyes wide in the green glow of her NVG reflection, and in that instant he made the calculation that countless men before him had made when cornered, fight or flight. He chose wrong. He lunged to the side, reaching for something at his waist. Mara moved. She closed the distance in 3 strides, her rifle transitioning to a retention position as she drove forward with the kind of controlled aggression that comes from years of close-quarters training. She intercepted him mid-reach, deflected his arm with her rifle, and executed a textbook takedown, sweeping his leg while driving her body weight through his center of mass. Al-Rashwari hit the ground hard, the air rushing out of his lungs in a stunned gasp. Before he could recover, Mara had him face down, knee in his back, flex cuffs coming out of her kit with practiced efficiency. Harakat Maka, don't move. She secured his wrists, patted him down rapidly, no weapons, just a satellite phone and a folded piece of paper with grid coordinates. High-value intel. She keyed her radio, her voice calm and professional. Kestrel actual Desert Serpent, jackpot secured. Tunnel exit eastern side. Target is cuffed and controlled. No shots fired. There was a brief pause, then Vasquez's voice came back, tight with adrenaline and relief. Copy, Serpent, bringing the team to you. The firefight inside the compound ended 3 minutes later. The remaining combatants surrendered once they realized their commander was gone and extraction was impossible. The assault team secured the site, collected intelligence materials, and moved quickly to consolidate at Mara's position. When Vasquez emerged from the main structure, he found Mara standing over Al-Rashwari, her rifle slung, her expression neutral, a thin line of blood running down her forearm from a gash she hadn't mentioned and probably hadn't noticed. Al-Rashwari sat on the ground, cuffed and silent, staring at her with the particular mixture of disbelief and fury that comes from being outmaneuvered by someone you never saw coming. Reyes arrived next, breathing hard, and stopped short when he saw the scene. He looked at Al-Rashwari. He looked at Mara. Then he looked at Vasquez and said, with something that might have been awe, "She was right about the tunnel." "She's right about everything," Vasquez said quietly. The platoon consolidated, secured the detainee, and prepared for extraction. As they moved back toward the northern LZ, Ochoa fell into step beside Mara. His plate carrier still showed the impact crater from the round that had nearly killed him. He walked in silence for a few moments, then spoke quietly, almost too quietly to hear over the sound of boots on stone. "I called you a clerk." Mara glanced at him. "I remember." Ochoa swallowed hard, his throat working. "I'm sorry, Sergeant, I didn't know." Mara looked forward again, her expression softening just slightly. "You didn't need to know, you just needed to listen." She paused, then added almost gently, "But you're listening now. That's what matters." Ochoa nodded, said nothing more, and the platoon continued through the darkness toward the waiting helicopter, intact, mission complete, and carrying with them the slowly dawning understanding that the soldier they had underestimated was the reason they were all still breathing. On the flight back to Fob Kestrel, Mara sat near the rear of the Chinook, her rifle across her lap, her eyes distant. The medic had wrapped her forearm. The gash was superficial, already clotting, but she barely registered it. She was thinking about the mission, about the route, about the 100 small decisions that had kept everyone alive. Across from her, Reyes caught her eye and nodded once, a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement of something that didn't need words. Mara nodded back. And somewhere beneath her rolled sleeve, the Desert Serpent coiled in silent satisfaction, exactly where it had always been, patient, waiting, and finally recognized. The Chinook touched down at Fob Kestrel at 6:12 hours, just as the first pale light of dawn began to bleed across the Hindu Kush Mountains. The ramp dropped, and 3rd Platoon filed out into air that was already beginning to warm, carrying with them the particular exhaustion that follows a successful mission. The kind where adrenaline has burned through your system and left behind nothing but weight and the profound need to sit down somewhere quiet and remember how to breathe normally again. Al-Rashwari was transferred immediately to a secured holding area, escorted by military police who had been waiting on the tarmac. Vasquez delivered a quick verbal report to the battalion operations officer, confirming precious cargo and 0 friendly casualties. The formal after-action report would come later, but for now, the essential facts were enough. Mission complete, target secured, platoon intact. Mara was the last one off the helicopter. She walked slowly, favoring her left leg slightly, not from injury, but from the deep muscle fatigue that came from holding a static position for over an hour in cold ground while waiting for a tunnel exit that might never have opened. Her uniform was streaked with dirt. Her face was drawn. The bandage on her forearm had already soaked through in one corner, a small bloom of red showing against the tan fabric. She carried her rifle with the same controlled precision she always did, but there was something in her posture now, not exhaustion exactly, but the kind of weariness that comes when you have been holding yourself together through sheer will, and the mission is finally, mercifully over. She headed toward the barracks without speaking to anyone, intending to clean her weapon, file her notes, and disappear into the quiet anonymity she had cultivated since the day she arrived. She made it halfway across the compound before Vasquez's voice stopped her. "Calloway." She turned. Vasquez stood near the TOC entrance, his expression unreadable in the early light. "Debrief in 30 minutes, full platoon, you're expected." Mara nodded once and continued toward the barracks. 30 minutes later, she walked into the common area that served as the platoon's informal briefing and gathering space. A plywood-walled room with mismatched furniture, a coffee maker that had been broken and repaired so many times it qualified as a historical artifact, and a wall covered in maps, patrol schedules, and photographs of soldiers who had rotated out months or years ago. The room smelled like stale coffee, boot leather, and the faint chemical tang of gun solvent. The entire platoon was there. Vasquez stood near the front, arms crossed. Reyes leaned against the far wall, his usual position when he wanted to observe without participating. Ochoa and Cross sat in folding chairs near the center, still looking like men who had come very close to something terrible and were still processing what it meant to have survived. Tully stood near the door, chewing gum slowly, his eyes tracking Mara the moment she entered. And as she stepped into the room, something happened that no one had planned, that no one had ordered, that existed entirely outside the formal structure of military protocol. One by one, every soldier in the room stood up. It started with Tully. He stopped chewing, straightened from his lean against the doorframe, and came to his feet with the slow deliberateness of someone making a choice. Then Cross. Then Ochoa, moving stiffly because of the bruise that covered half his chest where the round had impacted his plate carrier. Then the others, rising in a quiet, cascading wave, not snapping to attention, not saluting, just standing, silently, their eyes on her. Reyes pushed off the wall and stood. Vasquez was already standing, but he shifted his posture, squared his shoulders, and the gesture carried a weight it hadn't carried before. The room was completely silent. Mara stopped just inside the doorway. For a moment, just a brief, unguarded moment, something flickered across her face. Not surprise exactly, not emotion in the way that civilians understood emotion, but recognition. The kind that comes when you realize that something you stopped expecting a long time ago has finally, against all odds, arrived. She didn't say anything, neither did anyone else. Then Vasquez stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the dismissiveness or detachment it had held 3 weeks earlier. It was plain. It was honest. It was the voice of a man who had made a mistake and was willing to own it in front of everyone who mattered. "Staff Sergeant Calloway," he began, and the use of her rank, her full rank spoken with weight and respect, was its own kind of correction. 3 weeks ago, I assigned you to comms and perimeter duty because I made assumptions about who you were based on incomplete information and my own limited perspective. Those assumptions were wrong. They were disrespectful, and they put this platoon at risk. He paused, his jaw working briefly, then continued. The Korangal ambush should have been a disaster. 2 men pinned down, flanking element closing in, and we had no idea it was coming. You did. You intercepted enemy communications no one else was listening for, identified a threat no one else saw, and you talked our people out of a kill zone using nothing but your voice and your experience. You saved lives that day. The room remained silent, every soldier listening with the kind of focus that comes when words actually matter. Vasquez gestured toward the map still spread on the table from the mission brief. Last night, you built a mission package in 11 hours that most intelligence shops would take 3 days to produce. You identified a tunnel exit that wasn't in any official reporting. You positioned yourself exactly where you needed to be. And when the target ran, you were the one standing in his path. No shots fired. No casualties. Mission complete. He looked directly at her, and for the first time since she had arrived at Fob Kestrel, there was no barrier between them, no rank disparity, no gender assumption, no institutional hesitation. Just one soldier speaking truth to another. You've been the most prepared, most competent, and most professional soldier on this fob from day one, Vasquez said quietly. And it took me 3 weeks and a near disaster to figure that out. That failure is mine, not yours. Desert Serpent earned her call sign a long time ago. This platoon just needed time to catch up. He extended his hand. Mara looked at it for a moment, then stepped forward and shook it, a firm, brief grip that said everything that needed to be said. Then Reyes moved. He crossed the room with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who had spent 3 weeks being wrong and had finally run out of pride to protect. He stopped in front of Mara, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, like the words were harder to say than any tactical order he'd ever given. I pushed you on that PT run because I wanted you to quit, he said bluntly. I wanted you gone before you became a problem. I was wrong. You're not a problem. You're the reason half this platoon is still breathing. He extended his hand. I'm sorry, Sergeant. Mara shook his hand without hesitation. We're good, Reyes. And just like that, the barrier broke. Ochoa stood next, his face pale but his voice steady. You saved my life in the Quarangle, and you saved it again last night when you planned a mission that didn't get me killed. I don't know how to. Thank you. Cross nodded in agreement, unable to find words but not needing them. Tully stepped forward from the door, his usual smirk replaced with something quieter, more genuine. You're the real deal, Sergeant. Glad you're on our side. One by one, the men of 3rd Platoon acknowledged her, not with speeches, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet, unadorned respect that soldiers give to other soldiers who have proven themselves in the only way that matters. And Mara accepted each acknowledgement with a nod, a handshake, a brief word, her expression calm but no longer closed. Something had shifted. Something had changed. When the last man had spoken, the platoon began to disperse, slowly, reluctantly, as if no one quite wanted to leave the moment behind. Vasquez lingered near the door, and as Mara passed him on her way out, he spoke quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. You changed this platoon. Mara stopped. She considered his words for a long moment, then shook her head slowly. No, sir, they changed themselves. I just gave them a reason. She walked out into the Afghan morning, the sun now fully risen over the mountains, painting the base in harsh golden light. She found a quiet spot along the perimeter, an approved observation post overlooking the valley, and sat down on the sandbags, her rifle across her lap, her eyes on the distant peaks. She rolled up her sleeve and looked at the Desert Serpent coiled around her forearm. The ink was faded now, worn by years and sun and the friction of combat uniforms, but it was still there, still clear, still hers. For the first time in months, Mara allowed herself a small, private smile. The desert had remembered, and so had they. 4 weeks after the Pech River Valley raid, another Chinook descended through the copper-colored Afghan sky and touched down at Fob Kestrel in a storm of dust and rotor wash that had become as familiar as breathing to everyone stationed there. The ramp dropped, and a single soldier stepped off. Specialist Taya Brooks was 23 years old, fresh from advanced individual training at Fort Gordon, and visibly nervous in the way that all new arrivals to combat zones are nervous, trying to project confidence while everything inside them is screaming that they are in over their head and everyone can see it. She wore her uniform with crisp precision, her rifle slung exactly as the manual prescribed, and her eyes moved quickly across the base, cataloging, measuring, trying to orient herself in a landscape that was utterly foreign and unforgiving. She was a signals specialist. She had graduated top of her AIT class. She had scored expert on her rifle qualification and maxed her PT test. And absolutely none of that mattered now, because she was standing alone on Afghan gravel with a rucksack that felt like it weighed more than she did, watching a platoon of hardened combat soldiers barely glance in her direction. This was the moment every new soldier dreaded: the arrival, the assessment, the cold calculation of whether you belonged or whether you were about to become a liability that everyone would resent. Taya took a breath, squared her shoulders, and started walking toward the cluster of buildings that looked like they might be billeting. She made it 10 steps before a voice called out to her. "Specialist." She turned quickly, almost too quickly, and found herself facing a broad-shouldered man with sergeant's stripes and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone and left in the sun too long. Sergeant First Class Nico Reyes. She recognized the rank immediately, snapped to a position of attention that was parade ground perfect, and waited. Reyes walked toward her with the slow, measured stride of a man who was no longer in any hurry to prove anything. He stopped a few feet away, looked her over once, not dismissively, not judgmentally, just assessing, and then did something that would have been unthinkable 6 weeks earlier. He extended his hand. "Reyes," he said simply, "welcome to Kestrel. You need anything, and I mean anything, you ask. We run a good unit here. We take care of our people." Taya blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the straightforwardness of the greeting. She shook his hand, her grip firm despite her uncertainty. "Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate that." Reyes nodded toward the barracks. "Billeting is that building on the left. Com's tent is past the motor pool. Chow Hall is the one that smells like burned coffee and regret. You get settled, then find me or Lieutenant Vasquez for your orientation brief. Don't try to figure it all out yourself on day one. Ask questions. Nobody here is going to bite your head off for not knowing something." He paused, then added with something that might have been the ghost of a smile, "Not anymore, anyway." Taya felt some of the tension in her chest ease slightly. "Copy that, Sergeant." Reyes turned to leave, then stopped and looked back. "And Specialist, if anyone gives you a hard time, you come find me. That's not how we do things here." He said it with the kind of quiet authority that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. It was policy. Taya nodded, genuinely surprised, and watched him walk away. She stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened, then picked up her rucksack and headed toward the barracks, still nervous, still uncertain, but feeling just slightly less alone than she had 30 seconds earlier. From across the compound, Mara Calloway watched the entire exchange. She stood in the shadow of the TOC, arms crossed, her rifle leaning against the wall beside her. She had seen the Chinook land. She had seen the new arrival step off, seen the nervousness in her posture, the way her eyes had scanned the base looking for judgment. She had seen all of it because she had lived all of it, and some part of her, the part that remembered what it felt like to walk into a space where no one wanted you, had been waiting to see how the platoon would respond. And now she knew. Lieutenant Vasquez appeared beside her, moving quietly in the way he had learned to move after enough months in places where noise got you killed. He followed her gaze across the compound toward Reyes and the new specialist, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Vasquez said quietly, almost to himself, "That wouldn't have happened 6 weeks ago." Mara didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Reyes, watching him direct Brooks toward the barracks with the kind of patience and respect that had been entirely absent when Mara herself had arrived. No, she agreed. It wouldn't have. Vasquez turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. You changed this platoon, Calloway, whether you want to admit it or not. Mara finally looked at him, her eyes calm and unreadable in the harsh Afghan sunlight. She considered his words carefully, the way she considered everything, and then she shook her head slowly. No, sir. They changed themselves. I just gave them a reason. Vasquez studied her for a moment as if trying to decide whether to argue the point, then nodded slowly. Maybe, but not everyone could have done that. Most people, when they're treated the way you were treated, they get angry. They get bitter. They fight back or they shut down. You just kept working, kept proving yourself, until there was no room left for doubt. Mara's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained steady. Respect isn't something you demand, Lieutenant. It's something you earn, or it isn't real. I learned that a long time ago in places a lot worse than this. She paused, then added quietly, and anger doesn't save lives. Competence does. Vasquez nodded again, this time with something that looked like genuine understanding. For what it's worth, he said, I'm glad you're here. This platoon is better because of you. I'm better because of you. Mara met his eyes and saw sincerity there, not the performative kind, but the hard-earned kind that comes from a man who has confronted his own failures and chosen to do better. She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and closure. We're good, sir. Vasquez smiled faintly, then turned and walked back toward the TOC, leaving Mara alone in the shadow of the building. She stood there for a few more minutes, watching as Brooks disappeared into the barracks and the base returned to its normal rhythm of patrols, maintenance, and the organized chaos of a forward operating base at war. The sun climbed higher. The heat pressed down. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with routine traffic. Life at Fob Kestrel continued as it always did, indifferent to moments of revelation and growth. But something had changed, something fundamental. Mara pulled back her sleeve and looked at the desert serpent coiled around her forearm. The ink was faded, the lines softened by years and sun, and the friction of uniforms worn in a dozen different combat zones. But it was still there, still hers, still carrying the weight of every mission, every intercept, every moment when she had moved unseen through hostile ground and struck at exactly the right time. She had earned that call sign in the deserts of Iraq, in places where mistakes were measured in body counts and survival was never guaranteed. She had carried it quietly, without pride or proclamation, because the work had always mattered more than the recognition. And when she had walked away from special operations, exhausted and hollow and ready for something quieter, she had buried the call sign along with the weight of everything it represented. But you couldn't bury instinct. You couldn't bury competence. You couldn't bury the part of yourself that knew how to see what others missed, how to act when others hesitated, how to bring people home when the margin between life and death was measured in seconds and split-second decisions. The Korangal had reminded her of that. The Petch River Valley had confirmed it. And now, watching Specialist Taya Brooks walk into a platoon that would treat her with the respect and dignity that Mara herself had been denied for 3 long weeks, she understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. Change wasn't about one person. It was about planting something, a seed, a standard, a new way of seeing, and trusting that the ground was fertile enough for it to take root. 3rd Platoon had learned. They had changed. And the next soldier who walked off that Chinook would walk into something different than what Mara had walked into. That was enough. Mara rolled her sleeve back down, picked up her rifle, and turned toward the communications tent. There was intercept work to do, patrol routes to analyze, intelligence reports to file. The mission never stopped. The war never paused for moments of reflection or personal growth. There was always another valley, another compound, another high-value target waiting in the mountains. And Mara Calloway, Staff Sergeant, Signals Intelligence Specialist, Desert Serpent, would be ready. Because some soldiers didn't need recognition to do their jobs. They didn't need validation or awards or stories told about them in briefing rooms and mess halls. They simply did the work, kept their people alive, and moved forward into the next mission with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who they were and what they were capable of. The Afghan mountains rose in the distance, purple and vast in the afternoon haze, indifferent to human struggle and human triumph alike. The desert had seen empires rise and fall. It had swallowed armies and erased entire civilizations from memory. It remembered everything and nothing, depending on what you brought to it. Mara looked at those mountains one last time, then turned and walked back into the compound. The desert would remember her. It always did. The end.